Okay, so I'd like to say a little bit more about Shakespeare before moving on. One of the things you'll learn about me is that I'm a little obsessed with Shakespeare. So it's the kind of thing I'm not going to shut up about Shakespeare. He's an author that I'm obsessed with. I spent the last 4 years of my life just like obsessing about Shakespeare. So let's talk about Shakespeare some more. One of the things, the reason Shakespeare is so important is because there are other writers who are as funny. There are other writers who are as violent. There are other writers who are as good with character psychology. There are other writers who are as good with beautiful language. There are other writers who are as good with ideas. Literature, as I'll be talking about later this semester, is a type of thinking. And so if someone writes an essay, a philosopher writes an essay, they're thinking about some subject. But when Shakespeare writes a play, he's also thinking about some subject. A good piece of literature is a type of thinking. It's a form of thinking. Just like you might make an argument in 101 and you have a thesis statement and you have points, the characters in a play have points. And that's the artist is sort of thinking through ideas, themes is what we call it in 201, right? It's the idea of the play. What are the themes, the philosophical themes? So anyway, the point is that there are people who are as good at all these things as Shakespeare. But Shakespeare's the only one who can do all of that really well at the same time. Not the only one, but maybe the only one. I don't know. Um, James Bond, for example. If you know James Bond, he's very good at like shooting a gun close range, and he can do sniper stuff, and he can hack into computers, and he can go undercover and pretend to be somebody else, and he can drive a car in a fancy, aggressive way to avoid getting shot or shoot at people or whatever, and he can do underwater shit. He can do everything. Um, the things James Bond does are not necessarily unrealistic. It's unbelievable that one person would be able to do all of those things. Usually, if you're familiar with kind of military organizations like that, there's one guy whose job it is to drive really well, and there's another guy whose job it is to jump out of a plane in a parachute, and there's another guy whose job it is to do hand-to-hand combat, and there's another guy who is there to do whatever gun stuff. I don't know, computer hacking. So James Bond is a character who sort of combines all of these things. Shakespeare is a writer who combines all of these different things. Um, so that's one of the things that makes Shakespeare a useful thing. He's got so much in it. There's so much in a Shakespeare play to talk about, whereas most writers would have some to talk about. But there's more. There's more in Hamlet than just about any other work of literature I can think of. It's a lot to do there, which is why I picked it. The other reason I'm picking Shakespeare, and it's also worth talking about why I'm picking any of the philosophers we're looking at, is that he's influential. Um, this is one of my main points as a teacher, is that the world looks the way it does because one of the reasons why the world looks the way it does, one of the reasons why art looks the way it does, is because Shakespeare did a bunch of stuff in 1600, and everybody learned from him, and everybody copied him, or everybody decided to react against him, or whatever they did. The point is that Shakespeare helped kind of build the world that we currently live in. So when you read a Shakespeare play, all these things will come up, and they're surprisingly modern things. Um, so like one of the things Hamlet is about what we would today call manic depressive states, sort of manic depressive behavior, or severe clinical depression. And they didn't have that term back then, but they had Hamlet, and he was a picture of the illness. And later on, we put some names to it. Psychologists, put names to it. But one of the ways psychologists got there is from reading Hamlet. One of Freud's more important things was reading Hamlet. So the reason I give you Shakespeare is because it's very influential. It's the same philosophy behind why the class looks the way that it does. Most teachers teaching this will give you like sort of four different schools of philosophy. And they all tend to be modern. If you take this class with another teacher, they're likely to give you, say, four 20th century schools of thought. It's going to be like feminism, psychoanalysis, Marxism, mythology. Um, and they're all the people you'll read will be from like the 1930s to the 1990s or whatever. The way I do this class is a little bit different. I'm interested in ideas that go way back. And so we're starting with Plato. We're starting with ancient Greece from 2,500 years ago. And a lot of the philosophers we're going to be looking at are happening across the centuries. We're going to be all over the place. We're going to look at people from, the 20th century, and we'll also be looking at people from the 19th century and the 18th century and the 17th century. Look at ancient people like Plato. So there's a whole bunch of, I'm trying to think about different eras. We keep having these debates in modern day society about like, what does this mean and what does that mean? Um, and we have them like we've never had them before. Like I keep hearing people have discussions about things, and it's like, didn't we do this already? So whenever somebody has a modern day debate, I'm always interested in going back to see who was the first person that wanted to have a conversation about this subject. So just to give you a simple example, you know those little fidget spinners, those little the little toy you hold between your fingers and spin it like this. Um, I'm friends on Facebook with all kinds of teachers, and they were like, "Oh, this is terrible! It's such a distraction. Kids these days can't pay attention, and they can't learn because they just want to fidget spin, and they're not paying attention in school. This is disruptive." And people were like freaking out, like it was like a new problem. Because the fidget spinner was new, that didn't exist until a couple of years ago. Um, but then I was like, but the yo-yo? Like yo-yos have been around since ancient Greece. This is like it's a toy. And again, it's a little different. It has a string, but it's still people, especially kids. They like toys that spin. It's fun to watch something spin around that fast and you know do weird things to the center of gravity. A yo-yo is also a toy that spins, and kids had them in school, and it wasn't the collapse of Western civilization. So it just when everyone was talking about the fidget spinner, I was like, did they? And they had yo-yos going back to ancient Greece. So I was like, what are we really talking about here? Like, don't act like this is new. Same thing for our literary problems. When we ask questions about literature, the answer, people have had this conversation already, sometimes in other countries and centuries ago. So one of the things I like to do is go look up things from other countries and from centuries ago, because I think it's worth spending time with that kind of material, just to see where did this conversation get started. So when your friend goes to an art museum and sees a picture of somebody and says that doesn't really look like a person, that doesn't look like, if you draw a picture of your friend and they're like that doesn't really look like the person that we know, um, they are making a claim. They're saying your art is bad because it's not realistic. Well, where the hell did the idea that art is supposed to be realistic come from? Well, we're going to be looking at that because that's what I like to do, is to look at old stuff that is sort of still influential today. So that's basically the outline of the class. Cool. And I think and the other thing about Shakespeare that's really important to understand is that Shakespeare, when we go to a movie in modern day America, we don't want people to spoil the end. You'd be mad if somebody spoiled the end of Avengers Endgame for you. Um, but Shakespeare's time, they didn't really do that. Shakespeare wrote a bunch of plays. People mostly knew how they ended. They were about famous historical figures. Shakespeare didn't really make up his own stories. He found stories in books, in history books and in fiction books, but these stories already existed. Like, he didn't invent Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet was a poem written by somebody else, and it's not a very good poem. Shakespeare turned it into a very good play, and people now think he invented it, but he didn't. The point is that when audiences went to go see Romeo and Juliet, they knew Romeo and Juliet would be dead at the end of the play, right? In fact, if you've ever seen Romeo and Juliet, they tell you right at the start that they're going to kill themselves. Two houses, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. So right, the opening line, that's the beginning of the play. They tell you right there, Romeo and Juliet kill themselves. So the reason I'm telling you this is because a lot of students feel like it's cheating or something to go read a summary of the play before you read the play, or to watch a movie of the play before you read the play, or to read it in translation or something. That's not a good example. But the point is that it's not cheating. You're just doing what audiences did back then, which is if you know the story before. Normally, if you go see a movie, you don't want to know the story ahead of time. But if you try to read a Shakespeare play like that, you're going to be so confused. If you're trying to read something and you have no idea where it's going. Whereas with Shakespeare, if you know what's going to happen ahead of time, it makes the whole play easier to understand. And so that's why I recommend that you do that. It's not cheating. It's just recreating the experience that audiences had at the time. They knew how these things ended. They weren't there to see what happened next. They were there to listen to the language. Just like when you go see John Wick, you're not really there to see what happens next. You know what happens next. He's going to kick everybody's ass. You're there to see the punching and the kicking. Well, with Shakespeare, you're there to see the language. And knowing the plot ahead of time will help you pay attention to the words and the ideas and other things. And yeah, okay, cool. I think we're doing good. So I'll pick you up in the next video. Thanks for watching these.